The decline in the respect for the dignity of man, for Kant, resides in the fact that man does not dare to use his reason in accordance with its scope and limits. The Enlightenment followed the Renaissance, which followed a long period of Roman domination in which the Roman military and engineering spirit curiously settled upon the sect of Christianity as its chosen religion. The narrative of the life of Jesus was, of course, addressing the problem of man's failure to use his reason, by suggesting that man instead love his neighbor and enemies as ends in themselves. But the narrative contained certain fantasy-laden supernatural events which raised questions about the validity of the account, given the previous heritage of the power of logos and argumentation from the Greeks. Part of the dispute between Jung and Freud centered upon the role of sexuality in personality development, a thesis Jung contested. Freud never abandoned his sexual stages, but he did widen the scope of the meaning of eros, to include all life-affirmative thinking and activity. Darwin had been the inspiration for much of Freud's so-called mythology of the instincts, which included the sexual instincts under the broader category of the life instincts, eros. Freud and other Darwinians were largely responding to the fact that evolution had, for some reason, ensured that humans spend a long time being dependent upon their parents, thus creating the need for institutions such as the family to endure for long periods of time. This, however, was not the only reason for the insistence upon the importance of sexuality. Freud's clinical experience with his neurotic patients regularly encountered sexual fantasies of certain kinds. Much time was spent analyzing and interpreting these fantasies. So, Freud, in fact, responded positively to Jung's criticism by expanding the scope of the meaning of eros to include civilization-building and culture-creating activities. The Kantian emphasis upon the will and its relation to treating humanity as an end in itself was to be transposed to a lower psychological level by Freud, into the instincts and their vicissitudes, and Freud specifically claimed that he had charted the path of only some of the instincts. What he meant is not entirely clear, but we should remember that Schopenhauer had written a work entitled The World as Will and Representation, and in it he referred to the phenomenon of the will, operating according to a principle of mercy, operative in the case of the heroic policeman. Is this something separate to what Kant meant by the good will, or is it the case that the good will is in fact partly a vicissitude of this principle? The good will obviously has a sensible aspect, and this might be a part of that aspect, i.e. there is nothing in Kant to prevent us from postulating that he adopted the hylomorphic thesis that psychological powers built upon other powers as well as integrating themselves with other powers. Freud referred to his psychology as Kantian, and he also referred to the Huglings-Jackson neural thesis that lower parts of the brain can be integrated into the higher parts. In this case, the categorical imperative which urges mankind to treat his fellows as ends in themselves could be construed as a higher-level vicissitude of the principle of mercy. Campbell discusses this principle in another essay in this collection in relation to the work of Thomas Mann. It has to be said that there is a tendency in Campbell's presentation of Freud's ideas to fail to see that, in relation to the Freudian dictum, where ID was their ego shall be, it is the energy of the ID that is used for the purposes of the ego and the superego, and all three systems are integrated with each other. These systems, that is, are not as separate as some commentators claim. Van der Post comments upon the loneliness of modern man, and claims that this was a symptom of his times. For the Greeks, what man had in common was related to Sush and its attendant capacities and powers, but for Kant it was the good will that was the driving force. This is not to say that man, in fact, universally possessed a good will, but rather possessed a consciousness of the imperative that he ought to treat his fellows as ends in themselves. The imperative to think rationally is also a demand made in the form of an ought to. Man ought not to contradict himself, but, as we all know, this demand does not hinder him from doing so, thereby contributing to the presence of confusion in the world. This could be clearly seen in the case of the tyrants of the time, who inverted good and evil, and made the worst argument appear the better. Freud's work became, with time, less materialistic and more Platonic and Kantian, whilst at the same time being rooted in the hylomorphism that was present in his medical training from Vienna University. Insofar as Freud could be regarded as concerned with man's spirituality, this was not in the form of the imagination and fantasy, but rather in the form of the way in which Eros and Logos produce order and good in the world. Of course, Thanatos and uncontrolled desires and fears were also striving to use the energy of the ID for more narcissistic purposes, and the domination of such forces may partly account for the loneliness of modern man, Van der Post referred to. Previously, one of the functions of myth was to bring men together via narratives that clarified man's relation to the realm of the sacred, and all that was required for such stories were both an understanding of certain categories of judgment and an active imagination. As the world became more complex, it was inevitable that reason and argumentation would be needed to give man an understanding of his relation to this world, in which the sacred appeared to become more and more marginalized, and this too might have contributed to man's feeling of loneliness. Paul Ricoeur's work on Freud and the symbolism of evil, in particular, provide us with critical insight into the power and limitations of mythical thinking. He points out that myths contain symbols of evil which call for philosophical interpretation, a form of interpretation analogous to Freudian psychoanalytical interpretations of dreams and pathological symptoms. Symbols, myths, symptoms, and dreams, then, all possess a latent manifest structure, a complex form of double meaning, in which the latent meaning is in some sense disguised/revealed by the manifest, unless submitted to the logos of an interpretation procedure, which relies on Aristotelian hylomorphic and Kantian critical theory. According to Ricoeur, both myths and symbols, when correctly interpreted, reveal the relation of man to the realm of the sacred. Van der Post's diagnosis of the loneliness of modern man may be connected to the phenomenon articulated by Julian Jaynes in his work on the origins of consciousness, namely Deus absconditus, the phenomenon of the absent God that has left man alone to his fate. For Jaynes, several engravings of an empty throne being approached by a king symbolize the advance of the secularization process and its effect upon religion. Freud may well have had this phenomenon in mind when he referred to science and gardening as displacement activities, vain attempts to fill the void that has been left in the life of modern man. We ought to recall, in this context, the remark of the once scientifically inclined Wittgenstein that science sends him to sleep. For him, this modern world has nothing of the attraction of the bustling agoras of ancient Greece, the teeming Elizabethan London streets conversing about the latest play of Shakespeare, or the cosmopolitan Königsberg with its drawing-room gatherings during the time of Kant. Things have undoubtedly changed whilst we have been occupied with making the worst argument seem the better. The Kleinian Renaissance art critic Adrian Stokes, in an essay entitled Greek Culture and the Ego, had this to say about the golden age of ancient Greece. The truest wisdom lay in a properly balanced personality in which neither side triumphed at the expense of the other. What this meant can be seen from the place given to Eros, which means in the first place passionate love, but extends its meaning far beyond physical desire to many forms of intellectual and spiritual passion. For Parmenides, it is the child of necessity and the force which makes men live and thrive. For Democritus, it is the desire for beautiful things. For Euripides, it is the inspiring spirit of the arts. For Pericles, it is what devoted citizens feel for their city. For Socrates, it is the pursuit of noble ends in thought and action, if the complete force of man's nature works as a single power. He is a full man, and no Greek of the great days that this was the right and natural way to behave. Collected Works of Adrian Stokes, Volume 3, London, Thames and Hudson, 1978, page 84. Eros, insofar as Plato and Aristotle are concerned, is probably all of the above. Eros being, according to the Symposium, a mediator between man and the gods. Divine Eros, for Aristotle, was of course connected to his metaphysical characterization of God, who was engaged in thinking about himself as well as producing all movement and motion in the universe. Adrian Stokes embraces most of the above account of Eros, and also Melanie Klein's analyses of the instincts of man and their relation to good and bad, part and whole objects. She agrees that, during infancy, there is a tendency for the infant to be enveloped by objects such as the mother. When the I is subsequently formed more and more by the lost objects of the ego, there is more and more respect for the independence and self-sufficiency of these objects. Stokes picks up this reasoning in his analysis of a certain kind of Renaissance art object, which he designates as Quattrocento Art. Such art objects, he argues, are whole objects in virtue of their independence and self-sufficiency. They are, he argues, a restorative response to the depressive anxiety generated by past lost valuable objects. Such art enables us to become less dependent upon external objects. The internal objects of the mind are also more integrated with each other, and this in turn enables a more harmonious relation to the external world as such. Strong personalities, neither for Klein nor Stokes, do not view being alone as a problem, exactly because their dependence upon external objects is minimal. This relation to the external world and its modernity, which encourages a more narcissistic relation to objects, enables these individuals with strong personalities, possessing superior subtle intellects, to correctly diagnose the condition of modern man and see the loneliness of the modern world as related to depression and the mania related to narcissism. Such individuals may, like Kant, see the whole as melancholically haphazard and restrict their participation in society to a minimum. Jung, according to Anthony Storr in his work, noted that Jung was concerned too with the attribution of pathological symptoms and behavior to what he called the spirit of the times. Freud took a more nuanced approach and attributed the discontent to be universally found in modern society to a system that is ill-adapted to man's legitimate desires and fears, and further traced this phenomenon to its source in man's long childhood. The pleasure-pain principle was not, in his view, regulated by the reality principle of the Aristotelian golden mean, and our children thus had more difficulty growing up with balanced personalities and appropriate behavioral patterns. Freud may have regarded excursions into the realms of the paranormal as symptoms of the modern malady, a turning away from the melancholically haphazard external world toward a more satisfying inner world, where there were mechanisms operating that one could control. Projecting spirits into the external world was, for Freud, a sign of a serious lack of psychic harmony, and may be a sign of an unstable, unbalanced mind. The phenomenon of possession, so fascinating for the people of Jung's time, became a source of fascination for Jung, who became interested in the phenomenon of multiple personality. Jung was less inclined to see such a disturbance of normal behavior and thought as unstable, and more inclined to view this phenomenon as introverted. Whether possession, for example, was detrimental for mental health would depend for him on which of the unconscious archetypes were responsible for what we were experiencing. Anthony Storr claims that Freud was obsessed by the body, and that therefore Jung's fascination with the spiritual world came as a welcome relief. This overlooks the philosophical view of the human body, Sush, that we find in Aristotle and Spinoza, which cannot be accused of being materialistic. Aristotle's hylomorphic view was that the Sush is constituted by a constellation of organs, a configuration of limbs and posture that enables a particular form of life to form as a result of the power of these organs and limbs, which includes the power of the brain, eyes, ears, speech, bipedal activity, etc., and the influence of the sexual organs on the life choices man makes. The capacity for discourse and rational thinking and argumentation are obviously higher-level activities and are therefore part of the essence specifying definition, rational animal capable of discourse. Freud largely embraces this hylomorphic view of Sush, as he does Kant's philosophical and critical view of the powers of the mind, and especially the importance of episteme insofar as knowledge of the self is concerned. Mere self-consciousness would not be sufficient for Kant to characterize the spiritual life of man. The Kantian faculty of sensibility, the home of sensuous imagination, the instincts, and the a priori intuitions of space and time are clearly more biological than spiritual, but no one can surely deny that the faculties of the understanding/judgment and reason were not spiritual. These faculties were possibly not spiritual in the sense Jung intended, but given Kant's criticism of spirit seers, such a criticism cannot be taken seriously without first confronting Kant's arguments from that article. Spinoza's claim that the first idea of the mind is the idea of the body characterizes well the intimate relation the mind has to the body. We also find in Spinoza's writings reference to the more general phenomenon of change in the universe, when it is claimed that all entities of whatever kind strive to maintain themselves in their existence. If we refuse to interpret Spinoza's reflections as pertaining to hylozoism and consider only life forms as a specific category of being, then we can see in his work pre-Darwinian ideas that also appear to be in line with some ideas we find in Aristotle's hylomorphism. Indeed, Spinoza's reflections appear also to support and predate the Freudian so-called mythology of the instincts. Freud also, in some of his later writings, addresses the higher psychological functions, when he reflects upon the operation of the ego as a precipitate of lost objects. He refers to higher psychological functions in his group psychology and the ego, but there is no acknowledgement of the positive power of religion to structure our psychological capacities and powers, an acknowledgement, moreover, which is undoubtedly present in both Aristotelian hylomorphic and Kantian critical philosophy. Bearing in mind this omission, which leaves readers with the impression that religion has no positive psychological value, the later theorizing of Freud can be seen as an interesting elaboration upon Kantian ideas relating to the faculty of sensibility, the transcendental ego, and the realm of the noumenal. Kant, in his Anthropology, elaborates in more detail upon this idea of the I. The sum total of pragmatic anthropology in respect to the vocation of the human being and the characteristic of his formation is the following. The human being is destined by his reason to live in a society with human beings, and in it to cultivate himself and moralize himself by means of the arts and sciences. No matter how great his animal tendency may be to give himself passively to the impulses of comfort and good living, which he calls happiness, he is still destined to make himself worthy of humanity by actively struggling with the obstacles that cling to him because of the crudity of his nature. Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View, edited and translated by Loudon R.B. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 2006, p.15. We can see from the above quote where the inspiration for the agency of the superego came from, and we can also see how powerful the instincts are in this process of actualizing our higher capacities and powers. Against the background of the above reflections, it is difficult to see exactly why Jung wished to claim in an interview about his relation to Freud that he was influenced by Kant. If the influence ran as deep as he claimed, then there would not have been this deep disagreement over the role of the instincts, eros, and the superego in the process of personality development. On the issue of Jung's commitment to the occult and the paranormal, which Freud characterized as the black mud and rising tide of occultism, it is difficult not to see in this commitment a lack of focus on the role the reality principle and the external world play in any account of the human sush. Campbell, however, it must be admitted, is not committed to any form of occultism, and much of what he has claimed would have been well received by both Kant and Freud, except perhaps his view of Jung's work. We know Wittgenstein was a follower of Freud, and according to the American philosopher of aesthetics, Stanley Cavell, Wittgenstein was concerned to put the soul back into the body. Freud, witnessing the rise of American behaviorism, was equally concerned with this task, but he was also concerned not to claim for the spirit or mind more territory than it actually occupied in the phenomenal realm. He was, it ought to be recalled, particularly concerned with the Cartesian obsession with consciousness, which Freud believed was merely the tip of the iceberg of the mind. Kant, Freud, and Wittgenstein would not have sanctioned the view of the afterlife we encounter in occultism, nor would they have sanctioned a belief in ghosts, poltergeists, and possession by the devil, and their grounds would have been the grounds of logos and reason, the grounds of understanding and rationality.